Order. Order. Gregor Poynton to move the motion.
Thank you, Mrs Vaz, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'm delighted to begin this important debate on the fiscal impact of the UK 2024 budget on Scotland. Mrs Vaz, the Chancellor, on October the 30th, delivered a budget that was the largest ever settlement for the Scottish Government in the history of devolution. It means an additional £1.5 billion for the Scottish Government to spend in this financial year and an additional £3.4 billion next. This amounts to a total of £47.7 billion for Scotland's budget in 25-26, the biggest financial settlement in the history of devolution. Mrs Vaz, this is a budget that keeps Labour's promises to Scotland and to the Scots who put their faith in a Labour government. But the road ahead is not easy, and not all individual decisions made in the budget were easy. The appalling economic inheritance left to this government by the Tories, which gave us austerity, Brexit chaos, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, needs clearing up. After 14 years of Tory chaos, division and decline, this budget turns the page on those lost Tory years, fixing the foundations and rebuilding our country. It supports Scottish businesses to get the Scottish economy motoring again. It provides funding for green-free ports, city growth deals, GB energy and hydrogen projects to fire up growth and deliver good jobs across Scotland. It removes connectivity black holes through Project Gigabit and the shared rural network, which boosts 4G coverage in the Highlands and Islands, and provides £125 million for GB Energy, headquartered in Aberdeen, with hubs in Edinburgh and Glasgow. It funds 2 hydrogen projects in Cromarty and Whitelee. It extends the innovation cluster in Glasgow City region for a further year. It implements the 45% and 40% rates of theatre, orchestra, museum and galleries tax relief to provide certainty to businesses in Scotland's thriving cultural sector, and provides Scotland's world-renowned whisky industry by providing up to £5 million for HMRC to reduce the fees charged by the Spirits Drinks Verification Scheme, and ending mandatory stamp duties for spirits from May this year. It kickstarts growth at a local level by investing £1.4 billion in local growth projects across Scotland across the next 10 years, including £26 million for the 4th Green Freeport. The list goes on, Mrs Vaz. This budget supports working people by boosting national living wage, resulting in a pay rise for around 200,000 of the lowest paid Scots, and extends a temporary 5p cut in fuel duty, benefiting an estimated 3.2 million people in Scotland with a benefit of £58 per year. This budget also supports Scottish pensioners and those in welfare benefits. This government's commitment to the triple lock will see over 1 million Scottish pensioners benefit from £8.6 million a year more over the course of this Parliament. Pension credit is up, benefiting 125,000 of the neediest pensioners in Scotland, and it uprates working age benefits by inflation, resulting in 1.7 million families in Scotland seeing their working age benefits going up by an average of £150. It reduces the maximum level of debt repayments that can be deducted from a household's universal credit payment each month from 25% to 15%, which will benefit the average Scottish family by over £420 a year. And that's not all. Labour's manifesto commitment to brand Scotland has also been realised. An initial investment of £750,000 this year will fund trade missions, promote Scottish goods and services around the world, and help Scottish businesses export for the first time. Mrs Vaz, this budget also marks the end of the era of austerity. It provides billions of investment in public services and prioritises investment in our economy to jumpstart growth while raising money from those with the broadest shoulders. It provides significant increases in investment to ensure we have the public funding available for Scotland's NHS, our schools and our public services. This is, in short, a budget that is good for Scotland.
Alistair Carmichael.
One other thing that the budget did was it removed the ring fence around agricultural support payments. Surely intervention as significant as that in the operation of a UK-wide market is something that should be done on a UK-wide basis. I just don't understand the rationale for the Treasury decision. Can he explain it to me?
Thank you. As I said at the start, not all the decisions in this budget were easy. We had been left a horrible economic inheritance from the Tories, and to make decisions, we needed decisions that needed to tackle that and clear the mess up that they had made. Indeed, decisions in this budget mean that the Scottish Government is receiving more per person than the equivalent UK Government spending for the rest of the UK. As I said, in 25-26, we will see the biggest financial settlement to the Scottish Government in the history of devolution. Sadly, however, we know from bitter experience that more money to the Scottish Government does not guarantee success, because the SNP are taking Scotland in the wrong direction and they've been careless with Scotland's money. Go ahead, sir.
Ms Logan.
He speaks of the ending of austerity, but how can he say that whenever we've seen the removal of the winter fuel payment and a refusal by the Labour government to end the two-child cap?
Sir, we have delivered the largest budget settlement in the history of devolution. That is the end of austerity. Well, you have it, sir. You have it to spend. Decisions they've made have left a black hole in Scotland's finances. The billions in extra cash delivered in this budget must not be simply used to cover up the SNP's buy now and pay later policies. That money must reach the front line to bring down waiting lists and to drive up educational standards. The SNP have nowhere to hide now. I will give way.
Red Cross.
The changes to NICs means that Aberdeenshire Council are going to have to find £13 million extra in this year's budget. How's that going to help with education standards and health in Aberdeenshire?
Gregor Poynton.
The largest settlement that we've ever received to the Scottish Government in the history of devolution is driving up additional funding that can be spent in Scotland. The SNP, they have nowhere to hide, they have no more excuses, they cannot continue to blame others for their own economic and financial incompetence. Because the problems in the Scottish public services are not solved by simply having more money to spend, the Scottish Government needs to get much, much better at spending it. I will.
Dave Dugan.
I'm grateful for the honourable member giving way, and let me first apologise for chuntering for my sedentary position. That wasn't very polite of me. He says the SNP can no longer, we need to see an end to the SNP's buy now, pay later. He will be, of course, familiar with the fact that the SNP and any other Scottish Government has to have a balanced budget every year. So what does he mean by buy now, pay later?
Gregor Poynton.
So they're in a position that you can borrow to invest. You also have announced that you're ending the two-child cap, but with no money to pay for it. That, to me, is buy now and pay later. So because the Scots can see the SNP have lost their way, they're out of ideas, and their ministers are incompetent and they're wasteful with public money. Scots earning just over £29,000 a year pay more in tax in Scotland than the rest of the UK, something Scottish Labour will look at if we win the next election. And what will Scots do? What do Scots get for these higher taxes? A government that wastes millions on delayed discharge and agency staff on our NHS, on ferries that do not sail, and on pet projects that do not deliver for Scotland. All the while by decimating local community funding, meaning vital services are lost. Where, for example, is the vision for reform of Scotland's NHS, which lurches from crisis to crisis? What was once an annual winter crisis stretches further and further into other seasons too. Our heroic NHS staff do a fantastic job under the most difficult of circumstances, but they and the Scottish public are being badly let down by their political leadership, who waste millions on delayed discharge and agency staff. This week, we've seen the UK Labour Government commit to a plan to get waiting times down from 18 months to 18 weeks and put in place the firm foundations to deliver proper social care services. Where is the SNP's ambition on either of those two issues? I will.
Bishop.
They're like nothing more than to talk about the Scottish Government, and they do it every time they get the opportunity. But does he not understand the depth of anger right across Scotland in this budget? Whether that's pensioners who are currently freezing in their homes right now, whether that's child poverty campaigners disappointed that we'll do nothing about the two-child benefit cap, whether that's employers who are paying the cost of the national insurance, or whether it's farmers. Is this the reason behind this massive fall in Labour support in Scotland?
So there's a large intervention. But as I said before, there is you have the powers, you have the money. It is your decision as the Scottish Government to make those decisions that you talk about. And you complain about every single penny that we have raised in this budget, but that is money that has been invested in Scottish public services. You cannot complain on the one hand, you cannot enjoy the money that has been spent on one hand and complain about every penny piece that has been raised on the other. A National Care Service bill that was ill thought through and has now been binned, and no plan to reform or be ambitious for Scotland's NHS to deliver the care our constituents need. The proposed East Calder Medical Centre in my own constituency is a textbook example of how these failings manifest themselves at a local level. Patients, doctors, the local community and health board all agree we need a new health centre in East Calder. The one thing that is holding it back is the Scottish Government's management of NHS resources. With this year's unprecedented budget settlement, the funding is now there to deliver projects like this. There's no more excuses. Mrs Vaz, where is the planning reform to unleash growth and get Scotland building again? There's a terrible shortage of planning officers in Scotland and no plan to tackle it. There's no substantive commitment to build more homes and a sign of the action needed to make that happen. The drift and lack of vision is summed up in the Scottish Government's behaviour around the proposed Berwick Bank offshore wind farm. The planning application was submitted in December 2022, but still waits a decision from Scottish Government ministers. What are they waiting for? Why are they dithering? Why does it take so long for Scottish ministers to get a grip of this important decision? As the Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce has said, all they're achieving is putting potentially billions of pounds of investment and thousands of high-quality green jobs at risk. And the list goes on, Mrs Vaz. Where is the investment in our skills and the future of our young people, our economy and our country's prosperity? We know what the jobs of the future are. There are many sectors in which Scotland has the potential of competitive advantage if only they would take action and get ahead of the curve. But it's the precise opposite of urgency, ideas and energy from this Scottish Government. Why are we not preparing and supporting our workforce, young and old, with a wartime-like effort to train our people to take advantage of these enormous opportunities and grow our economy? More dither, delay, lack of ambition and vision for Scotland. And what are we doing to arrest the decline in educational attainment and the widening attainment gap? Well, Nicola Sturgeon once said that closing the attainment gap was the defining mission of our government. Instead, it is getting worse. Educational attainment for all children is down. For those children from the poorest homes, it is down most of all. What a shameful record of almost 18 years in power. For John Swinney, just being a bit better than Humza Yousaf is not good enough. This is a government not holding themselves or Scotland's public sector to anything like the high standards the Scottish people deserve. And so, in conclusion, I applaud the Chancellor's budget of October 30th. I applaud, above all, the huge investment in Scotland and the highest ever budget settlement for the Scottish Government. But the ball is now in the Scottish Government's court. They have nowhere to hide. They must halt their drift, the buck passing and managed decline. They must seize this opportunity to unleash the enormous potential of Scotland or make way for the Scottish Labour Government, who are ready and eager to make that happen.
Thank you. There are a number of honourable members who wish to speak, and we'll have to take wind-ups at about 3:28. So the question is that this House has considered the fiscal impact of the autumn budget 2024 on Scotland. Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Mrs Vaz, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And we always have to say that, but in this instance, I genuinely mean it. I'm grateful to be here to speak on this issue. When I saw this coming up on the agenda for Westminster Hall, I thought, goodness me, who's brought this? And it turns out it's the government that have brought this. And I thought, well, that's all right. Well, let's see what the facts are, because this budget had precious little in it to be welcomed in Scotland. But I'll start with that which could be welcomed for Scotland. And thankfully, the Chancellor heeded the SNP's manifesto call to change the fiscal rules to allow more investment in capital infrastructure. That was a good thing, that's a welcome thing, and that will be helpful. And they also heeded the SNP's pre-budget call for greater investment in the NHS, which will be very much welcome as we try and recover from COVID and challenges in staffing. But aside from those two things where the SNP gave the government a menu on, it's been unmitigated disaster for Scotland and Scotland's economy, imposing billions of pounds of tax cuts and service cuts and tax rises that will hit working Scots in the pocket and do very little, if anything, to deliver on the promise that the people of the United Kingdom were offered as a prospectus in the run-up to the election. Of course, I'll give way.
Local Crichton.
I just wonder how the honourable gentleman would describe £50 million for Argyll and the Isles and £20 million for the Western Isles as a disaster.
Dave Dugan.
So I'm hopeful that that money will be spent and make a great difference, but it won't compensate one bit for what I'll get on to just shortly, which is the money that the Western Isles and the Northern Isles have lost out as a consequence of Brexit. And I'm going to touch on what the mover of the motion heralds, and many of his colleagues herald, as the largest, I'll just do it now actually, the largest budget settlement for the Scottish Government, as though budget settlements go up and down. They continually go up. Every latest budget settlement is the biggest budget settlement since the last one. I've run out of opportunities. I've not run out of opportunities to point out how the basics of fiscal policy and basic economics work on this government as the various bills have passed through the chamber. And here we are again. So, all power to the honourable gentleman's communities, and I hope they get great benefit from that. But it doesn't compensate fully for that which they've lost. And no mistake, £40 billion of tax rises represents the biggest rise since Norman Lamont in 1993. And don't forget, Mrs Vaz, that when this government came in, they inherited the highest tax burden in living memory, or certainly at least since the end of the Second World War. So it's not like this was highest. So it's not like this was introduced on some sort of low taxation holiday spree and the Labour government came in and put taxes up to compensate for that. They were already the highest that anybody can remember, and now they've gone up by the highest level again in 32 years. Absolutely eye-watering. And the Chancellor's refusal to step back from the winter fuel payment cut to around 900,000 pensioners is absolutely... and they're chanting, Mrs Vaz, that it's devolved. No. They're chuntering that it's devolved, but of course let's get it on the record that it didn't used to be devolved, and at the same time as they devolved it, they went and cut the budget. That's your Labour government at a UK level for you. So yes, I know it's devolved. No. If the honourable gentleman can get one of his colleagues to intervene, I'll take them. The decision to raise national insurance, Mrs Vaz, was like, it's like, show me you don't know how the real economy works without showing me you don't know how the real economy works. So a punitive lowering of the floor and increasing of the rate to try and wring the money that was required to recover the economy out of employers, a drag on employment, a drag on investment, a drag on wage rises, absolutely unforgivable and totally counter to that which the government stated was their, or the Labour Party rather, stated was their aim ahead of the election, which was to create a budget for growth. Well, there will be no growth. There absolutely will not be growth as a consequence of that autumn statement. And they think they're going to raise over 20 billion, but by their own measure, by the Treasury's own measure, that figure, by the time they've made all the compensations, is down around about 10 billion now. So it's a massive swage of pain for very little gain in the investment. And also, when the mover of the motion said the SNP are very keen to spend the extra money that we're going to be getting, but we won't be saying how we would raise it. Well, I actually will tell them how we'll raise it, and it'll be a much more cogent way than the Labour government in Westminster has said that they will do it. And over and above that, in the Scotland-specific context, Mrs Vaz, the duty hike on Scotch whisky was an indefensible tax grab, in the words of the industry itself. But somehow we're expected to believe that this is all going to be okay, because Anna Sarwar is going to speak to the Chancellor about it, and the Chancellor will presumably do what the UK government always does when Labour in Scotland asks them to do something, which is absolutely nothing, if not the exact opposite. The mover also talked about energy. Well, you should go up to the north east of Scotland to talk about energy, because we're 6 months into this government and there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever of GB Energy making any impact in Scotland whatsoever. The last time I checked, they had one employee and they were based in Manchester. And also, he talks about investment that's going to be realised by that. Well, somehow, the Acorn project in Scotland, which is the most deliverable CCUS project across GB, has still not been funded by the Labour government, despite the fact that they funded a further two on top of the already two CCUS projects in Scotland, in England. So that's 4, England 4, Scotland 0. It's like a football match, sadly, Mrs Vaz. I'm very happy to
Tracy Gilbert.
I would just like to ask my honourable friends to the point that was made earlier around Berwick Bank and the consent and that in terms of green jobs and when that will happen to enable that investment to come forward. Another example of being held back.
Well, like her, I'm very hopeful that we'll see Berwick Bank approved and get into the construction phase as quickly as possible to cement Scotland's enviable position as the renewable powerhouse of Europe, Mrs Vaz. And I know that the honourable member shares that ambition like I do. But what we're talking about is due process. And I think it ill behoves elected members of any stripe or in any parliament to get to meddle in the statutory process of consenting major developments. So that will unwind in the way that it unwinds, but I very much hope that it's positive and I very much hope that it's expedient. And turning, Mrs Vaz, to WASPI women, they will absolutely be left wondering what they've done to deserve such a catastrophic betrayal by the Labour Party on their very modest and reasonable ambitions. I raised at the autumn statement that it was fantastic news that the government, to be fair, had made sure that the money was there for the infected blood scandal and also to make sure that the postmasters were properly compensated. Neither of those two scandals were of the UK government's making. Well, deliberately of their making, certainly in terms of the blood scandal, infected blood scandal. But the WASPI women was. And that's the one that we now know that they've turned their back on those people in the most reprehensible way possible. The Chancellor promised a growth budget. The mover of the motion says this is a growth budget. Well, sadly, GDP will remain unchanged over the next 5 years. And the inflation forecast is going to compound that. Inflation set to rise to 2.6%, interest rates to 0.25% just, and mortgage rates, a brief period of respite, mortgage rates are on the course to rise again after years. People up and down these islands, and especially in Scotland, years have been hammered by the cost of living crisis, including small business. We'll be looking at this hatchet job by the Labour Party and wondering what on earth is coming next. The IFS, no less, have pointed out that somebody will pay for these higher taxes and that somebody will be ordinary working people. The OBR also say that they estimate there's only a 54% chance that the Labour government will meet its own fiscal rules through this budget, raising the question of why the Chancellor thinks this amount of economic pain will result in such a low level of fiscal gain. Investors in the agriculture sector, Mrs Vaz, Scotland's agriculture is a very much larger part of Scotland's economy than agriculture is of the UK economy. And I'm sure the Chancellor never bothered to speak to anybody in Scotland about her raid on agriculture with her farmers' death tax. They could have done something progressive to stop outside investment and farmers disrupting that market, but they didn't, and they threatened the very existence of Scottish agriculture. So what would the SNP have done in closing, Madam Deputy, Mrs Vaz? The SNP would certainly not have put this colossal fiscal drag on the economy of Scotland. We would have made sure that it was progressive and that it was proportionate to that which would increase economic growth. The tax regime, which I'm sure members opposite are not very supportive of, on income tax in Scotland, if it had to have been, I will give way.
Which taxes the SNP would raise?
Dave Dugan.
Well,
Can I just remind the honourable member that he's had 10 minutes already, and if every other honourable member took that time, we just wouldn't get through them.
That's fine, Mrs Vaz. I'm just closing then. I don't think they will be speaking for 10 minutes, but that's not my job. So if the progressive income tax regime that's been implemented by the SNP in Scotland, which Labour criticised us when we had the powers and didn't use them, then they criticised us when we had the powers and did use them. If the UK government had mirrored our economic policy as regards fiscal policy as regards income tax, they would have raised about £16.5 billion across the United Kingdom. That would have not reduced to £10 billion because of compensations that you had to make, because it wouldn't have been a raise on employers' national insurance. You wouldn't have to compensate anybody. And also, they don't want to talk about Brexit, Mrs Vaz, but I want to talk about Brexit because it costs the UK £30 billion a year and it costs Scotland £10 billion a year. That would be a great increase in the economic output of Scotland and the rest of the UK, and they could scrap nuclear weapons, Mrs Vaz, as a final point, because the estimated budget of that in 4 years has gone up from 44 billion to 100 billion over a 10-year period, and there's an awful lot of investment that could be made in Scottish communities with that, which would boost Scotland even more. We already enjoy the highest number of GPs, nurses, midwives, teachers per head in Scotland. Anywhere else in the United Kingdom can't even touch the level of provision that we've got, and the Labour Party just going to have to suck that up.
So the honourable member obviously has the title of Mr Scotland. I'm afraid I'm going to have to impose a very informal time limit of about 4 minutes, and everyone should be able to get in. John Grady.
Thank you, Mrs Vaz. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I thank my honourable friend, the member for Livingston, for securing today's debate and his excellent survey of the considerable benefits of the budget for Scotland. I have to say, on economic forecasts, I'm a somewhat boring Member of Parliament. I like to read the FT, and the FT wrote a very, somewhat critical in some parts, article, but what it pointed out in its leader a few days ago was Britain's economic outlook, in fact, looks quite robust compared to other advanced economies. According to the Financial Times annual poll, economists reckon the UK will outgrow France and Germany this year. Labour's strong parliamentary majority is another positive for investors, as political uncertainty ramps up elsewhere. I could go on, but I simply point out that this government is pro-growth, pro-industry, and people understand that, and economists understand that. The budget delivered by my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, delivers on our commitments to the electorate. It gets rid of VAT on private school fees, providing more funds to state schools, including in Glasgow. It tackles poverty by increasing the national living wage, giving thousands of my constituents a pay rise. It provides pensioners with over £400 this year due to our commitment to the triple lock. And we are reducing the level of deductions that can be made for universal credit payments, a boost to struggling families in Glasgow. Now, if one was to listen to the SNP, one might think that this budget was absolutely terrible news for Scotland and an absolute disaster. In fact, it delivers the largest settlement for Scottish Government ever, £4.9 billion of additional funding over the next 2 years. A UK Labour government and 37 Scottish Labour MPs delivering for Scotland. This significant boost to Scotland's public finances is critical, with nearly 1 in 6 Scots on an NHS waiting list. And as we heard just before Christmas, there are many, many people who have been waiting for over 2 years for NHS treatment in Scotland, many, many more proportionally than in England. 1 in 3 Scots children are regularly absent from schools, and there are declining police officer numbers on the street at a time when people are petrified about crime. Scotland's public services are in utter crisis after almost 18 years of SNP misrule. And this government has provided the SNP government with the money. They have no excuses. They must use the funding wisely to clear up their mess. Now, SNP and Tory colleagues have repeatedly criticised the government's budget, but have failed to offer a credible alternative. Time and time again, they say we should spend more money, yet fail to explain where the funding should come from. This is not credible. One hears about magic money tree economics. Here we have a whole forest of magic money trees. Yes, we have made difficult decisions in our budget, but government is about confronting difficult decisions to manage public finances carefully. As independent experts are clear, the SNP have failed to manage the Scottish public finances. There have been 3 years of in-year emergency budget cuts due to their mismanagement, £5 billion wasted on failed SNP pet projects, whilst, for example, ferries do not sail and the islands suffer from appalling connectivity. The SNP, may I say, I think time's marching on and there are many people who wish to speak. The SNP cannot be trusted with public money, and remember, this is the public's money. People in Glasgow East face much higher income tax rates than their counterparts in England because of the SNP government's mistakes. As my friend, the Scottish Labour leader Anna Sarwar set out yesterday, After nearly 2 decades of SNP failure in government, Scotland needs a new direction. It needs a new government with new hope, new thinking and new solutions, not more of the same divisive politics of the last 2 decades. On July the 4th, people of Glasgow made a choice, and that is that our great city, in its 850th year, should be represented by a Labour government. That Labour government has delivered for Scotland by providing a record funding settlement. Scotland chose a Labour government, electing 37 Labour MPs. This budget, with its record increase in funding for Scotland, demonstrates the Labour government's absolute commitment to Scotland. I'm obliged.
Okay, Harriet Cross.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I congratulate the honourable member for securing this debate. But I do find it odd how Scottish MPs have been celebrating this budget as if it's the best thing ever to come to Scotland, especially as it is nothing short of disastrous for so many of our key sectors which underpin Scotland's economy, its communities and livelihoods. The Chancellor spoke and still does about protecting working people, indeed growing the economy in order to help working people. Yet her decision to increase employers' national insurance contribution does exactly the opposite. This £25 billion tax grab on businesses impacts their resilience, growth, investment, hiring decisions and longevity. The scale of this tax rise, the scale of the betrayal by Labour, who promised not to raise taxes on working people, including national insurance, is completely unprecedented. And for the avoidance of any doubt, because I do know that Labour seem to struggle with this, business owners are working people and they employ working people who contract working people, who supply working people who then can work elsewhere. So this next rise is a tax on working people across Scotland, across the UK, and there is no credible way that that can be denied. And this is also an upfront tax. It's a tax for having employees. They pay the tax just for having employees on the books before they even open their doors. So take weeks like this in Scotland, in my Gordon and Buchan constituency, where many businesses haven't opened because of snow and ice. This tax bill is still racking up, despite them not being able to trade. But of course, the effects of NICS is wider than just businesses. We've got charities, GPs, pharmacies, local authorities are all also impacted. I've met with my local Inverurie medical practice, and their NICS bill is going up by £75,000. They can't pass on this cost, and if they were to reduce services, they'd also have their funding reduced. So what do the Labour MPs who are celebrating this budget suggest that they do? And as I've already mentioned, Aberdeenshire Council, £13 million of NICS rises to now find, and that's on top of a £40 million black hole that they already had due to North East councils being so poorly funded by the Scottish Government. And then moving on to other matters, such as business property relief and agricultural property relief. The changes to these are cynical, cruel, misguided and absolutely damaging to the key sectors of our economy. Family businesses are the backbone of our economy, up and down the country, but including in Scotland. And this changes will decimate family businesses who have been nurturing for generations, who are the centre of their communities and who employ over 14 million people nationwide. The changes to APR, which I've spoken about a lot, demonstrate the government's complete disconnect with rural farming and ways of life. That we know that the Treasury figures are incomplete. They don't consider farms where only BPR have been claimed. Labour seem to think that all farmers are married and that both spouses will be able to pass on their farm at the same time, and effectively that it's okay to force farmers into early retirement, for them to have to leave their family home or pay full market rent to stay at the property that they've been on their entire lives. While the Treasury hides behind the claims that only 2,000 estates will be affected, we've seen that the CLA, NFU, NFUS say that it's going to be more like 70,000 farms. These figures need to be considered. And the Chancellor, as we know, is literally making farmers decide between selling their farm, selling their land, their buildings, their machinery to raise the funds. And this will leave farms commercially unviable or severely damaged. And this is farms in our constituencies across Scotland, including many of the constituencies for the Labour members opposite. It's whisky, and as we've heard, so I'll just touch on it briefly. The Prime Minister stood in a whisky distillery in Scotland and promised to back the Scottish whisky industry to the hilt. But during this time, he failed to mention that he was going to increase tax by 3.6%, bringing the tax on a bottle of whisky to over £12 for the first time. And yes, of course.
Thanks, Honourable Lady.
Arthur.
And I know she's making heartfelt points, but what we're hearing yet again is a long list of all the money-raising initiatives we've taken, and these have been opposed both by yourselves and I can hear you've been cheered on by your SNP colleagues. But I'd be interested to know from the Honourable Lady how her party would have raised the money needed to get public services in Scotland back on track. £5 billion extra coming to the Scottish Government, coming to the Scottish Government to help fund services in my constituency, the NHS, etc., and also the Honourable Lady's constituency. Where would her party have found that money?
Harriet Cross.
I thank you for that intervention, but as I've already said, you can give with one hand and take with the other, which is what's happening with NICs. You're taking this money away from out of councils, so it's completely irrelevant. And we've also seen, as we've said, that the ring fence has been removed in some budgets. And that has led, for example, for the rural affairs budget being not increased in real terms in Scotland, impacting our farmers again. So it goes round in circles. And I'll finally focus on oil and gas. And as we've seen, and as we saw instantly almost after the budget, the changes to the EPL and removing the investment allowances had an instant impact. Apache announcing very soon afterwards that they were going to pull out of the North Sea, citing the onerous impact of the EPL. Aberdeen Grampian Chambers of Commerce warning that 100,000 jobs are at risk. OE UK saying that 35,000 tied to specific projects are at risk. These are the changes to the budget that have real-life consequences across Scotland, but particularly in Gordon and Buchan, in Aberdeenshire, Aberdeen and North East Scotland. So in conclusion, this budget really shows the fundamental misunderstanding and undermining of Scotland's economy and communities by this Labour government. From family farms and businesses to distilleries and our energy sector, the high street, this government has chosen to burden rather than support businesses across Scotland.
I'm going to have to go down to an informal 3 minutes to get everyone in. So Torquil Crichton.
Mrs. Vaz, a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd like to pay tribute to the member for Livingston for raising this important debate. And I join him in welcoming this record settlement, and it is a record settlement of over £4 billion for the Scottish Government. But I wouldn't want members to go away with the impression that somehow the Scottish SNP Government is somehow just benignly mismanaging the economy or carelessly controlling the NHS or accidentally running down educational standards in Scotland. They are involved in nothing less than the willful destruction of the pillars of public life in Scotland and public services, because they're neglecting to make difficult decisions, putting off the reckoning there must be in education, where we must leave educationalists to educate and teachers to teach, neglecting transport, willfully neglecting transport in the Western Isles and the West Coast, and the health needs of constituents like mine in the Western Isles. My honourable friend spoke about 1 in 6 Scots on waiting lists. Madam Mrs. Vaz, in the Western Isles, my constituents, they're not on waiting lists, they're waiting for the sound of a helicopter to take them to hospital, because the NHS does not properly function in the Western Isles, thanks to the neglect and the lack of resources given to it by the Scottish Government. In the Western Isles, people do not take an ambulance to hospital or a taxi to hospital, they take a bus to an airport, to take a small flight to another airport, to take a flight to a mainland airport, to take a taxi to hospital, to get chemotherapy. That's the state of the NHS in Scotland under the SNP, and I will give way. Love to hear these excuses.
Thankful to the honourable member for giving way. He mentions the litany of failures as he would see it in Scotland's NHS. How then does he explain that spending per head is greater than the rest of the UK, doctors per 100,000 are higher than the rest of the UK, nurses per 100,000 are his airlifted constituents...
Sorry, I'm going to have to... Torquil Crichton, I think you've had 10 minutes, Mr Dugan. I'm really sorry, but
I thank the honourable member for his intervention and understand his passionate defence of his own position. But the truth is that despite higher spending per head in Scotland, that money is inefficiently used on a massive management structure, boards and quangos upon quangos, that don't put patients first, as we can see, as is evidence in the West Isles. And no better evidence of that comes in the transport decisions made for my constituents, where we have 3 companies, a Bermuda Triangle running ferry service of CalMac, CMAL, Transport Scotland, with hardly an island representative on any of these.
I'll ask the honourable member to address the chair, please.
So I must...
I'll ask the honourable member to address the chair.
I'm sorry, Madam Speaker. But on ferries, we welcome the very late arrival of the Glen Sannox and soon the Glen Rosa. A minor earthquake welcomed the Glen Sannox through the Sound of Mull as she made her test run. But we're glad they're there. But that's only one ferry crisis. There's another ferry crisis, and that's the inter-island ferry crisis, that the two ferries that connect and hold our Western Isles chain together. These ferries are limping on, and under the SNP's replacement schemes, they will not be replaced for another decade. Ferries that are made of 4 engines running on 3 engines. Our road between the Isles neglected and run down by the SNP. And I know time is short, so I won't detain the House much longer. And I've mentioned already the neglect of rural areas. We see that in rural housing, where we're facing a depopulation crisis. We're out of a budget of £25 million for rural housing. Only 17 homes have been built in rural Scotland. And all of that happens because they have a bigger budget. Of course, the Scottish Government have a bigger budget. We have no transparency on where that budget is going or how that money is spent. And the SNP, Scottish Government, have 1 year to turn that around. They better shape up or ship out.
Thank you. Jamie Stone.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Vaz. And it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I mean this most genuinely as well. One of the things you should never do in this place is bore the House, but I'm afraid I'm about to do so because I'm going to sound like a cracked record. How many times have I mentioned the ongoing scandals of pregnant mothers having to travel a 200-mile round trip from Caithness to give birth in Inverness? In weather like the stuff we have right now in the north of Scotland, you have to be joking. The A9 was blocked at Helmsdale a few days ago, and thank God no pregnant mum tried to make the journey down to Inverness. I have gone on again and again and again to the Scottish Government about having a safety audit done on this perilous, perilous policy. We had a consultant-led maternity service based in Wick in Caithness, and I will give way.
Talk or Crichton.
I take what he says about pregnant mothers having to travel long distances. In my own constituency, pregnant mothers have to travel 2 weeks before their baby is due to another island where they're given an overnight allowance of some £50 or £60 in a tourism economy where beds cost £120. So they're having to pay out of their own pockets for their pregnancy.
Jamie Stone.
It is a nonsense, and constituents like the Honourable Gentleman's and mine are losing out and have lost out for years. We had a consultant-led maternity services in Keith until, hey presto, the SNP government took over, and very shortly after that it was downgraded and got rid of, as simple as that. I have written, and others have written to John Swinney, inviting him to come north to Wick, to get in the back of an ambulance in winter and make the journey for himself to see what it's like. I do not believe we've had an answer, and I expect a dusty one when it comes. It is a scandal, it is a disgrace, and it's on the watch of the SNP government. Let me go further. Right now, we have one psychiatrist in the north of Scotland, one, and we have a huge problem of mental health for young people. Right now, I just rang a mother this morning, Kirstine Campbell from Caithness. She thinks it's 2 or 3 years before a child can be seen by a professional to sort out the problem. During the election, I spoke to a mother in Everton in Easter Ross. She told me how her child, I won't name her for obvious reasons, she told me how her child hadn't been to school for a number of years because of the fact that the school could not deal with the issues that this poor, wretched child had. It is a scandal. So, all I'm giving you in the short time available, Mrs. Vaz, is 2 examples of failures. And turning to the subject of the debate, I sincerely hope, I pray, that the Scottish Government will use this extra money to address these issues finally, before it's not too late, before something terrible happens on the young mental health front, or a mother or a child could indeed lose her life, or the child's life. We had an issue where a mother pregnant with twins, one twin was born in Golspie, and the other one had to be born in Inverness. Imagine how awful that is for a family like that. It's a shocker. And I close with this point. Look, the 2 issues I've outlined to you are issues that really, really, really matter to ordinary people. Absolutely, they're massive out there. You can talk about this or that in politics, but these are big chunky ones on the doorsteps. And people are not stupid out there. I hear from my good friends in the SNP sitting to my left, and they are good personal friends. But I tell you this, what happened in July, what happened when the Honourable Member for the Western Isles was returned with the bump that he was, when my majority went up from 204 to just 11 votes shy of 10,500, that, I think, is the Scottish people telling us something. And I think anyone who doesn't listen to that is simply whistling in the hurricane. Thank you.
Martin Rhodes.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. The budget of autumn 2024 marked a significant change, a break from the recent past. For too many years, Scotland and the rest of the UK has suffered from an era of austerity, bouts of ideologically charged fiscal and economic illiteracy, and a failure to invest in the present to deliver for the future. The UK budget heralded a new era of growth and investment for Scotland. It keeps the promises to Scotland made at the general election, ending the era of austerity, providing billions for public services, and prioritising economic growth. As has already been highlighted in this debate, the budget delivered the largest funding settlement for Scotland in the history of devolution. What we get in this budget is an end to the flawed, ideologically driven years of austerity, replaced with investment, sound public finance and redistribution. The budget delivered a pay rise for 200,000 of the lowest paid in Scotland through increases in the national living wage. A key test of any budget is how it balances the cost of expenditure and the raising of revenue to cover that expenditure. The significant test is who gains benefits and who covers costs, and how they are balanced. Inevitably, in most budgets, costs and benefits are spread. But what is key is how the distribution is stacked up. This budget shows a very clear pattern of redistribution. Those with the most bear the greatest costs, and those with the least gain the greatest benefits. The budget, together with the government's commitment in the New Deal for Working People and the Employment Rights Bill, indicate a significant and welcome change in direction at the UK level with direct benefits for Scotland. Investment for economic growth, resources for our public services, an end to austerity with a commitment to redistribution running through it. The approach by the Chancellor, this break from the recent past, needs to be built upon by the Scottish Government. Sadly, the Scottish Government's recent government proposals failed to show the leadership required. Despite the record level of funding in the UK budget for the Scottish Government, the SNP Government has failed to use the opportunity to deliver better outcomes for the people of Scotland in their budget proposals. I thank my honourable friend, the member for Livingston, for securing this debate today. I believe it is important to have such an opportunity to reflect on the scale and ambition in the UK budget, turning the page on the recent years of economic ineptitude and missed opportunities, and in its place, securing investment for economic growth and public services and redistribution of resources. A budget for Scotland and the rest of the UK.
Thank you very much. Seamus Logan. You don't want to speak?
Seeing as you've asked me to speak, Ms Vaz, I will speak very briefly.
Thank you very much.
I thank you for inviting me, and I'm very grateful to serve under your chairmanship. And I thank the member for Livingston for securing this important debate. Now, I've only one point to make because we're short of time. Members on the Labour benches continually mentioning to us about the ferries. The ferries. I've heard the ferries mentioned more times than I've heard Slade played over Christmas, and that was quite a lot. But you never mention HS2. The people of Scotland are paying for that. They're paying for Trident as well. They're paying for Hinkley Point. They're paying for Hinkley Point. No, I will not, in retaliation for you. No, I'm not giving way. Hinkley Point, Reactor 1, delayed now until 29, maybe 31. Hinkley Reactor 2, we've no date, and Reactor 3, well, God.
Oh, no.
Oh, finally give way, yes.
Thank you, and forgive me for not giving way to him when I was mid-flow in my own speech, but we're waiting until 2032 for our ferries, 2031, 2032. We need ferries this winter, not next decade.
Seamus Logan.
Thank you for your intervention, but the point I'm trying to make is that you continue to refer to fiscal mismanagement when in fact these are examples of fiscal mismanagement that the people of Scotland are paying for.
This Parliament's responsible for.
Absolutely. So I'll leave it there, Ms Vaz, and thank you very much.
Joanna Baxter.
Thank you, Mrs Vaz, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I thank my honourable friend, the member for Livingston, for securing this debate. This Labour government has committed £47.7 billion in funding for Scotland for 25-26. The largest budget settlement in the history of devolution, and that includes £3.4 billion allocated through the Barnett formula, supporting Scotland's public services to get back on their feet. It prioritises investment in key public services, including significant funding for our NHS. That's an additional £789 million in health-related consequentials for 24-25 and £1.72 billion for Scotland's NHS in 25-26. Despite this unprecedented financial support, Scotland's NHS remains in crisis. 1 in 6 Scots now sits on an NHS waiting list. Social care remains a significant area of concern under the SNP's leadership. And whilst our UK government has announced plans for an independent commission on social care and has put in place an interim package of support, the SNP have had to abandon their National Care Service bill, wasting millions of pounds of taxpayers' money, all the while 9,000 people in Scotland wait for social care assessments and support. My constituents in Paisley and Renfrewshire South would no doubt question why, given the level of financial support the Scottish Government has, the local SNP-controlled Renfrewshire Council have just made the disgraceful decision to approve £19.1 million of cuts to health and social care provision across my constituency. This decision will directly affect the most vulnerable people in the communities in my area, and it comes on the back of cuts already made to the closure of the Montrose care home and cuts to vital services such as the Falcon Day services, which support people with disabilities, and they're further evidence of the SNP's lack of a coherent plan to fix social care in Scotland. We are running short of time, so to enable others to get in, I will leave it with this. The Labour Government's investment in Scotland marks a new chapter for Scotland, one that prioritises investment in public services that work for Scottish people and are fixing the foundations of our country. The SNP have no excuses now and nowhere to hide. They should use the money they've been given to support the most vulnerable people in our communities.
Thank you. Kenneth Stevenson.
It's an honour to serve under your chairship. Can I begin by thanking my honourable friend for bringing this debate forward today? It is right that we recognise the positive impact this budget will have in Scotland. For too long, residents in my constituency of Airdrie and Shotts have been let down by governments who have treated working people as an afterthought. They have been let down by incompetence both from Conservative governments and here in Westminster and SNP governments in Holyrood. Indeed, Mrs Vaz, they have felt the impacts in their pockets and can see the impacts in their depleted public services. However, this budget puts us on a positive journey towards changing that. This is a budget that delivers the largest settlement for Scotland since devolution, and that will allow potential to be unlocked and public services to be invested in. It is a budget that has ended the era of Tory austerity, puts working people back to the forefront and prioritises economic growth. It is a transformative budget. Mrs Vaz, that has been a long time coming, and it is a little surprise that it is a Labour government delivering it. Indeed, Mrs Vaz, I did think that the Scottish Government would have been pleased with the settlement they have received from this UK Labour Government. It has given them the opportunity to right the wrongs of their almost 20 years of mismanagement and incompetence and deliver a budget that works for Scotland's working people. Yes.
Jamie Stone.
I wonder if the honourable member would agree with me, and he's making an excellent contribution. Would you agree with me that the reason that the SNP government did not welcome the announcement was that the Labour government successfully shot the fox?
Stevenson.
I entirely agree. And we could go on about GTEs, 800, 1,000 missing. They promised that. We could go on about ferries. We could go on about everything. We could go on about selling off the seabed for well under what was required, and not having any manufacturing input in Scotland for wind turbines or solar or absolutely anything, any advanced manufacturing. No, I will not give way. Yet only yesterday we heard from the First Minister of Scotland, who ironically warned that not supporting his budget would play into the hands of populists. All the while, Mrs Vaz, he leads a party that has spent almost 2 decades pitting working Scots against one another in the interests of the Scottish National Party rather than the interests of Scotland. People can see through the Scottish Government, just as they saw through the Conservative UK Government, their attempts to desensitise the electorate to the horror stories we hear on a daily basis will fall flat, because this Labour budget ensures that they have the money, they have the power, and there cannot be any more excuses. They have the votes. The First Minister should end the shadow boxing and focus on using the settlement provided by the Labour Government to deliver for Scotland. This Labour budget is promising for the people of Airdrie and Shotts, and I look forward to working with the Scotland Office and other departments to ensure these impacts are felt. The Airdrie and Shotts constituency was at the heart of Scotland's old industrial heartlands, and it has all the skills and ability to be at the heart of a modern industrial strategy in this new era. I am pleased that this Labour budget will unlock the potential of my constituency and its people to do so. Thank you, Mrs Vaz.
Thank you. Graham Downey.
Thank you, Mrs Vaz. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Chair, for years the SNP Scottish Government was able to blame an incompetent Tory government for their own failures. Tory austerity had huge impacts for Scotland. They crashed the economy, took money out of vital reserved areas such as defence, and oversaw the systematic destruction of communities and failed to properly invest in our country. But the SNP have also failed in their 17 years in power. Scottish Fiscal Commission, Audit Scotland, the Fraser of Allender Institute and others have all criticised the SNP's failure to respond to the pressures on Scotland's public finances. Indeed, Chair, just before I came to the debate today, I read that the Scottish Fiscal Commission has warned the Scottish Government that their back-of-a-fag packet commitments could mean a cut to 15% to other areas of public spending. Scottish people deserve better. I'm going to choose not to give way because I'm very conscious of time and others still wishing to speak. The SNP has fundamentally failed to use the powers the Scottish Government has to grow Scotland's economy and has instead presided over low growth and low productivity, areas that the UK Labour Government are now fixing, and the Scottish Government should be learning lessons. Time and again they have chosen political division over real progress. The litany of failure is embarrassing and they don't like hearing about it, but here it comes again. From wasting millions of pounds of public money on ferries, failed attempts and expensive attempts to fix health and social care, reductions in police numbers, cuts to fire and rescue, longer NHS waiting lists and higher taxes on working Scots than any other part of the UK. They even robbed Scotland's offshore wind resources to paper over 17 years of failure. And all of that lies firmly at the door of the SNP Scottish Government. Most worryingly, Mrs Vaz, they have failed in fully devolved areas such as education and skills to give young people the opportunities and support they need and deserve to fulfil their own ambitions and meet their aspirations. The long-term impact of the pandemic on young people is often forgotten, with isolation leading to missed opportunities, lost life experiences and still unknown impacts on mental health. Yet the SNP are telling health boards not to even ask for additional funding despite the increase in their budget. Madam Chair, the SNP excuses must now be at an end. This Labour Government has ended austerity in the UK by delivering the largest budget settlement in the history of devolution, with an extra £4.9 billion available to spend. It delivers a pay rise for 200,000 of the lowest paid Scots and ends the injustice of the miners' pension scheme, giving more money to miners in constituencies like mine, with money that will now boost the economies in those areas. The question for the SNP is, what will they do now they've run out of excuses? I would hope they would use the power and funds they have to take action, like finally making good on a promise to build a new health centre in Kincardine that was promised over 10 years ago in my constituency, to invest properly in NHS dental services. Mrs Vaz, it is an outrage that there are currently no dentists in my constituency taking on new NHS patients, to properly fund our police to help tackle antisocial behaviour like we have seen recently in Dunfermline city centre, Chair, the 2024 UK budget has delivered for the whole country, and this UK Labour government is getting on with the job in health, education, transport and the funding of local services, all while the SNP whinge, complain and deflect. It is time for them to take responsibility or get out of the way for a Scottish Labour government that will get Scotland heading in the right direction once again.
So I can get the last two speakers in if they take a minute each. It's your colleagues, not anyone else. Tracy Gilbert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I also want to congratulate my honourable friend and member for Livingston for securing this important debate. Seeing as we're so short on time, I will try and cut this down to a minute. Madam Chair, an area of the budget I would welcome is an announcement from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government over the recess to allocate £150 million to community projects across the UK, including £1.7 million to North Edinburgh Arts, part of the new Macmillan Hub in my Edinburgh North and Leith constituency. The new hub is the first of its kind in Scotland, co-locating a community-owned venue, third sector services and council services for the benefit of local residents. The Macmillan Hub will provide an accessible and high-quality creative learning, enterprise and meeting space alongside a social enterprise cafe, community garden, public library, a dedicated skills hub, as well as an early learning and childcare centre for 185 children. This investment will be transformative for the Muirhouse constituency, and it will be a joined-up approach, more of which I hope to see delivered.
Thank you very much. Richard Baker.
Thank you, Mrs Vaz. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. But with my 1 minute, I want to talk about a real opportunity for my constituents in Glenford and Mid-Fife to boost our renewable sector through investment which has been outlined in the budget, and also through the crucial decision which has been made by my colleagues in government through the hard work of the Secretary of State for Scotland, Ian Murray, and through the hard work of the Secretary of State for Business and Trade to secure the future of the Methil Yard in my constituency, along with the future of the Arnish Yard in the constituency of my honourable friend, the member for the Western Isles. Together, that saves over 350 jobs and skilled apprenticeships. What a fantastic opportunity we have, and I hope there will be collaboration between the Scottish UK Government to look to the future of both of those yards, because we have so much more potential than we are realising right now in our energy sector and in our renewable sector in particular. These yards have a crucial role to play. The potential they have to grow that workforce and economic impact is massive, and through GB Energy, based in Aberdeen, with a £125 million investment, the opportunity is there to build to the future too, with over £5.8 billion allocated to the National Wealth Fund. We should be working together to look to bids for how these yards can work in the future and secure economic benefit and growth for Scotland. So, with my minute, I think those are priorities we should look for the future, and they are priorities offered because of the actions taken by the Chancellor in this budget.
Thank you very much. I call the Lib Dem spokesperson, Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy. Mrs Vaz, it is a pleasure to serve under you as Chair, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Livingston on securing this debate on the impact of the UK budget in Scotland. I do welcome the increased investment in the NHS and vital cash boosts for Scotland, but with all due respect to the Honourable Member for Angus and Perthshire Glens, it cannot be underestimated how much we needed it, given the mess, the chaos that the SNP government has created in our public services over the past 17 years, and our ferries. Indeed, we hear today that the new Glen Sannox is being removed from service. Again, chaos. And I would agree with the comments from so many members, particularly the Honourable Member for CSE, Caithness Sutherland and Easter Ross, on the problems that we're facing. But while I do welcome the money in the budget, we have heard repeatedly from the Chancellor and other ministers, and no doubt we'll hear again today, that the government has had to take tough decisions since coming into office. Well, many of my constituents in Edinburgh West are beginning to say, yes, every government has to make tough decisions, but did this one have to make these decisions? Just before Christmas, I spoke to a number of businesses in Edinburgh West, and many of them are concerned about the impact, the negative impact, that increases in employer national insurance contributions will have on them. Some are worried they'll have to make cuts to staff. Others are trying to avoid putting up prices and passing the tax hikes on to the public. But all of them are trying to find ways of making it work, and all of them are struggling. 40% of Scots now believe more SMEs will close in their communities as a direct result of this government's decisions. More than half believe that prices will have to go up. And that's after the worst cost of living crisis in a decade. It's not what any of them needed. And it's also GPs and many social care providers who are coming and saying, we don't know how we're going to cope with this. Private contractors or operators who will not be eligible for employment allowance and will have to take on these extra costs directly. Within days of the budget, several GP practices contacted me. One estimated the changes will cost them more than £10,000 extra in the next year. So after 17 years of mismanagement under the SNP and the Conservatives, for 10 years, our GPs need support and investment. But everywhere you look in Scotland, the impact of this budget is not positive. Another tax change that will have direct consequences for my city of Edinburgh is the government's decision to impose VAT on private school fees. That's not just because I do not support taxing education or reducing the choice of parents that I do not agree with this proposal and see it as negative, but because it will have a real impact on both the state sector and the independent school sector in Edinburgh. Edinburgh has the highest proportion of independently educated children in Scotland, at between 20% and 30% every year. According to the local Labour Authority, 16 schools are expected to reach capacity before the end of this decade. If the predicted percentage of children dropping out of independent education into the state sector is true, the system will be stretched to breaking point. Sadly for many parents, introducing this change halfway through the school year is already causing issues. I've had representations already from parents who cannot find places for the children they've taken out of the independent sector in their local schools. Madam Chair, Mrs Vaz, there are other issues I would like to touch on. The impact on the whisky industry, and I would refer members to my register of interests. The farming industry, which was touched on by the honourable member for Buchan. But I think it's sufficient to say that Scotland, already under pressure from mismanagement by the SNP, is now facing a far from positive impact from its new government, in which it put faith at Westminster.
Thank you. Opposition spokesperson Andrew Bowie.
Thank you very much, Mrs Vaz. It's a genuine pleasure, again, to serve under your chairship here this afternoon. And I'd also like to congratulate the honourable gentleman, the member for Livingston, for bringing this debate today, although rather like the member for Angus and Perthshire Glens, I was a little surprised that it was a Labour MP that was bringing a debate on the impact of the budget on Scotland. And as much as I would like to spend my time this afternoon attacking the incompetence of the Scottish Government and their record, this is a debate on the UK budget brought by the UK Government, and so that's what I'll be focusing today. So I am grateful he has brought this debate and given us the opportunity to express the worry and the concern felt across Scotland as a result of this, frankly, disastrous budget that the Labour Party unveiled at the end of October. A budget that has seen already business confidence plummet, inflation tick up and hard-fought-for growth stall. Quite a feat. Don't take it from me, though. Take it from the Scottish business organisations, the Scottish Hospitality Group, who called it a blow to businesses across the country, the Scotch Whisky Association, who called it a hammer blow to their industry, Offshore Energy UK, who called it a difficult day for the oil and gas sector, the National Farmers Union of Scotland, who said it will have huge difficulties for family farms, all while the OBR forecasts lower growth for the UK as a whole. The biggest ever increases in taxes in one budget, hitting Scotland, already the highest tax part of the UK, even harder. Labour's tax-raising budget is straight out of the SNP playbook and, sadly, will hammer hard-working Scots. So let's take some of the decisions in turn. The decision to raise employers' national insurance contributions, which, by the way, they have done in a flagrant breach of their manifesto commitment not to do so. NICs have been raised by £25 billion, lowering the point at which contributions start. This Labour government is hammering the worst off, those on part-time work and those starting out, hampering their ability to get or hold a job. Labour's jobs tax will cost nearly £900 for the average Scottish job. I'd be delighted.
Tracy Gilbert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would my right honourable friend agree that actually 200,000 Scots will benefit from the New Deal for working people, some of the lowest paid, poorest families in our communities?
Shadow Minister.
There are businesses across Scotland who are now seeking to lay people off, not employ new staff. In Aberdeenshire and the north east of Scotland, there are energy companies who are seeking to lay off staff as a direct result of decisions taken by this government. And in fact, what we are seeing is the negative impact when it comes to growth and investment in Scotland as a result of this budget will actually have a detrimental effect for all people in the workplace in Scotland. So no, I do not agree that any of the decisions taken in this budget will be to the benefit of hard-working Scots. In fact, directly the opposite. This jobs tax, the increase in national insurance contributions, is an attack on working people, on our small businesses, on our economy, by this economically illiterate, it has proven so far, Labour government. And if you are a family business, such as Walker's Shortbread, William Grant, Tunnocks or Gap Group, this situation is compounded, made even worse by the changes brought in by the government's changes to business property relief. This will mean, in Gap's case, for example, a company that employs 2,100 people and already pays more than £50 million in taxes annually, an additional tax bill of between £50 to £100 million for simply wanting to move the business to the next generation. As Douglas Anderson of Gap said to The Times yesterday, this is simply a state penalty on family businesses. It is simply unfair. So that is Labour's workers. I will give way to my honourable
Dave Dugan.
I'm very grateful. Would he agree with me that money talks? Despite how we might argue in here, money talks. And is he concerned then that the yield on UK government gilts is now, over 30 years, is now 5.22%, the highest, even higher than it was when Liz Truss tanked the economy?
Andrew Barry.
Yes, in fact, I just read that a couple of seconds before I stood up to speak, and of course that is incredibly worrying. The trajectory of the UK economy under this Labour government, I think, should give us all pause for concern. And that is why I think it is right that this debate has been brought this afternoon. It's just another reason why I was surprised it was brought by a Labour MP. Yes.
If he doesn't wish to blame the SNP government for the economic mismanagement of Scotland, why does he provoke SNP members with his choice of Union Jack socks?
These socks were a Christmas present from my mother, and I promised her I would wear them at work, and that's what I'm doing today. So, and they're very good socks, so thank you for drawing the Chamber's attention to them. Anyway, that was Labour's workers' tax, their state penalty on family businesses. That was its first attack on business. So let's turn to its second attack on successful Scottish industry, specifically the Scotch whisky industry. The week after Burns Night, in a couple of weeks' time, tax on spirits like whisky will rise and continue to rise by a percentage higher than CPI. Already suffering from a decision to raise duty by 10% last year, something some of us protested about from within government at the time, which led to a reduction by £300 million in revenue for HM Treasury. This move increases the tax discrimination on spirits and undermines any claim this government can have to support Brand Scotland. If this is how it treats its national export, then we really have some big questions to ask. Taxing entrepreneurship and penalising success. But not content with hammering small businesses, our workers, and our most successful food and drink export, this Labour government are intent on destroying one of our most successful industries, an industry that is integral to the economic success of the north east of Scotland, on which so many thousands of jobs and indeed our energy security depend. And I speak, of course, of our oil and gas sector. The decision to extend and increase the energy profits levy, to remove most of the investment allowances and to ban all further exploration is driving away investment and leaving us far more reliant on foreign imports. The evidence is there. Apache have already said they are pulling out of the North Sea, and there were others to follow. Labour's changes to the windfall tax will cost up to 35,000 jobs and £13 billion in economic value. And all of this so they could splurge on eye-watering public sector pay rises, buying off their union paymasters, those that supported them into government. But I haven't finished yet. Yes, of course.
Joanna Baxter.
Does the honourable member not agree that actually that's not buying off union paymasters? It's delivering a pay rise for hard-working Scots.
Tell that to the hard-working Scots that are being laid off in Aberdeen and the north east of Scotland as a direct result of the decisions of this Labour government, as a direct result of their decision to extend the energy profits levy, ban new investment in the North Sea and preclude new exploration. Tell that to those hard-working Scots who are worried about what the decisions by this government will mean for them and their families and whether or not they will have a job in Aberdeen and the north east over the next few years. Those hard-working Scots are looking with terror at what this government is bringing down the line. But I haven't even turned to farming yet. I'm incredibly proud to represent some of the best farms producing the best berries, beef, lamb and crops in Scotland. The vast majorities of these farms are family-owned, and due to the changes in the agriculture and business property relief outlined when I described the situation facing family businesses, their future is incredibly uncertain. Many farmers have already come into my office and have claimed it's simply too expensive, too difficult to countenance passing that farm on to the next generation. This Labour government is overseeing the destruction of our family farms. But worse than this, the naivety or the incompetence, or possibly a terrifying combination of both, has seen Labour announce the agricultural funding to Scotland will no longer be ring-fenced. A specific and pointed ask by the NFUS, both during the election and indeed in the run-up to the budget. So, the impact of the budget 2024 to Scotland, in one word, disastrous. Our small and medium businesses hammered with additional taxes. Our family firms and family farms fearing for their future. Our whisky industry punished yet again for its success. Our oil and gas industry and its workers sacrificed on the altar of Ed Miliband's eco or maybe egomania. And our agricultural sector ignored. Our union, frankly, undermined. Growth falling, confidence collapsing, uncertainty rising, people and businesses worse off. That's the impact of Budget 2024 in Scotland. And I wish my friends in the Labour Party well in trying to sell this budget to the people of Scotland, who, I'm afraid to see, seem mightily unimpressed with their performance thus far.
Thank you. Minister Kirsty McNeill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It is indeed a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I first begin by congratulating the Honourable Member for Livingston on securing this debate on the impact of the autumn budget on Scotland and for his very dogged advocacy on behalf of those in his constituency who need the East Calder Medical Centre. Madam Chair, the UK Government was handed a challenging inheritance, £22 billion of unfunded in-year spending pressures, debt at its highest level since the 1960s, an unrealistic forecast for departmental spending and stagnating living standards. This budget took difficult decisions to restore economic and fiscal stability so that this Labour Government can keep the promises it made to the Scottish people. We promised to put Scotland at the beating heart of this government. We have. We promised to end austerity. We did. And we promised we would invest in Scotland's future. We are. Madam Chair, it's no surprise to me that we've had the usual carping from parties opposite. They simply cannot face facts, because the facts are these. This was a great budget for Scotland. It ensured, I'll make some progress, it ensured the largest real terms budget settlement for the Scottish Government in the whole history of devolution, with an additional £1.5 billion for the Scottish Government to spend this financial year and an additional £3.4 billion next year. It means the Scottish Government is receiving over 20% more per person than equivalent UK Government spending in the rest of the UK. And it delivered the most for those with the least, because that's what Labour governments do. I'll make progress. Madam Chair, at the election, Scotland was offered a choice: the politics of protest or the politics of progress. They chose the latter, and the result is a budget that protects working people in Scotland and delivers more money than ever before for Scottish public services. That's what change looks like. The Honourable Member for Edinburgh West has asked if these are the choices that needed to be made, and to that I say an unequivocal yes, because this government is simply not prepared to write cheques we cannot afford to cash. Madam Chair, the spectacular recklessness of the last Conservative government is something for which we await an apology. But in the meantime, it falls as ever to Labour to do the work of repair and renewal. It is our task to make whole what has been broken and to make the long-term decisions that will ensure Scottish families can get on and not just get by. The Chancellor, the Chancellor has made clear that while protecting working people with measures to reduce the cost of living, there would be difficult decisions required. Unlike the member for West Aberdeenshire and Kincardine, we are not prepared to shirk them. Please go ahead.
Seamus Logan.
She speaks of broken promises or Labour keeping their promises. But what about the promise not to attack the whisky industry? What about the promise not to raise national insurance as a tax? What about those promises?
Minister.
We have made responsible tax choices entirely in line with our manifesto. That's why the rates of employers' national insurance will increase by just 1.2 percentage points. The smallest businesses will be protected, as the employment allowance will increase from £5,000 to £10,500, allowing Scottish firms to employ 4 national living wage employees full-time without paying any employer national insurance on their wages. I will make some progress. This budget asks businesses and the wealthiest to pay their share while making taxes fairer. Those are Labour choices, and they're inspired by Labour values, as my honourable friend from Glasgow North has made clear. This is a progressive budget that values redistribution. And just as our budget, I'll make some progress, and just as our budget choices reflect our values, so too do the ways in which parties opposite choose to oppose them, whether it's opposing our end of the tax break on VAT on private schools, whether it's opposing, as the Honourable Member for Gordon and Buchan does, our attempts to bring the agricultural property relief into balance. As she will know, the latest figure from 2021 to 22 show that 40% of the value of APR went to just 7 claimants. That's neither sustainable nor fair, which is why I support the Labour government's changes. I will.
Harriet Cross.
That means, therefore, that 60% went to everyone else. 60% of farms in this country relying on APR in order to pass their farms down to the next generation, on BPR as well. This is the next generation of farmers who provide us food security, who employ people in local and rural areas. Does she not think that that's a really important thing to maintain?
Minister. As the honourable member will be aware, each year almost 3/4 of estates eligible for APR in the UK are expected to be entirely unaffected by these fair and proportionate changes. Ours was a budget, just as this is a government, squarely for working people. The honourable member for Angus and Perthshire Glens complained of the tax burden. Unlike the SNP Scottish Government, which simply wants to clobber teachers and nurses with ever higher taxes, we have delivered on our pledge to not increase national insurance or VAT on working people in Scotland, meaning they will not, thanks to this budget, see higher taxes in their payslips. Hundreds of thousands of workers in Scotland will benefit from an increase to the national living wage and a record increase to the national minimum wage. And the Chancellor has made the decision to protect working people in Scotland from being dragged into higher tax brackets by confirming that the freeze on national insurance contribution thresholds will be lifted from 28 to 29 onwards, rising in line with inflation so that they can keep more of their hard-earned wages. And we have begun the difficult work of restitching our fraying safety net. Thousands of Scottish households will be £420 a year better off on average as a result of our change to the universal credit fair repayment rate. Around 1.7 million families in Scotland will see their working age benefits uprated in line with inflation, a £150 gain on average in 2025-2026, and maintaining the triple lock means an increase in the state pension of £470 next year, on top of £900 this year for a million Scottish pensioners. And let me pay special tribute to the campaigners and fellow trade unionists who fought for changes to the mine workers' pension scheme. Thanks to their efforts and the decisions of this Labour government, nearly 7,000 retired mine workers in Scotland will get an extra £1,500 on average in their pension. Finally, justice for those who powered our country. I'll make some progress. The honourable member for Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross, and my honourable friend from the Western Isles, shared moving testimony about the impact of changes from the Scottish Government in rural communities. And my honourable friend from Paisley and Renfrewshire South talked about the crisis in NHS and social care. The answer to all these challenges is the same: investment in our public services. And that is exactly what this budget is designed to do. I'll make some progress. Now, Madam Chair, as you might imagine, while I have been listening very intently both to the speeches and the chuntering from the honourable members opposite, I've not actually been taking any notes about economic credibility. The Fraser of Allender Institute, Audit Scotland and the Institute for Fiscal Studies have all confirmed that the challenges in Scotland's public finances are a mess of the SNP's own making. And as for the party that bought us Liz Truss, I think the verdict of the people of South West Norfolk probably tells us all we need to know. I'd urge everyone instead to listen to my honourable friends from Dunfermline, Airdrie and Shotts, Glasgow East, Edinburgh North and Least and Glenrothes in Mid-Fife about how to get Scotland growing. Because, Madam Chair, our objective is, of course, not simply to rescue our economy from the havoc wrought by the Conservatives, but to grow our economy. That's why we've supported Great British Energy by providing £125 million next year to set up the institution at its new home in Aberdeen. A huge boost to the Granite City, inexplicably voted against by the member for Aberdeen South and his fellow SNP MPs. All people sent here to deliver for their constituents, but who instead sought to sabotage this investment that would benefit them. And, Madam Chair, I'm also pleased that we've been able to confirm our commitment to invest nearly £1.4 billion into important local projects across Scotland over the next 10 years. We've also confirmed that all 12, I'll make some progress, that all 12 regions of Scotland will be covered by a growth deal. Our investments include nearly £890 million of direct investment into Freeport's investment zones, the Argyll and Bute growth deal, and other important local projects across Scotland. No, I'm going to make some progress. These, Madam Chair, are all the choices of a government resolutely focused on the future. In conclusion, Madam Chair, this budget does exactly what Scottish Labour was elected to do. It secured billions for Scotland. The SNP voted against it. I'm going to make progress. I'm going to make progress. It secured billions for Scotland. The SNP voted against it. It delivered a pay rise for 200,000 of the lowest paid Scots. The SNP voted against it. And it ended Tory austerity. The SNP voted against it. The simple fact is they are out of roads, out of excuses and out of time. This budget helps us invest in Scotland and rebuild Britain. I'm proud to tell my constituents I voted for it, and I look forward to seeing all the ways in which it will change Scotland for the better.
Thank you. Gregor Poynton to wind up.
Thank you, Mrs Baz. I think it's been a valuable, if not always consensual debate. And I'd like to thank the honourable members for Angus and Perth Glens, Gordon Buchan, Aberdeenshire North and Murray East. I didn't agree necessarily with all or much of what they had to say, but I do believe that their views are genuinely and passionately held. To the member for Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross, I know he will, but I for one won't tire of hearing him continue to raise the issues he raised in today's debate until we have resolution to them. To my honourable friends, the member for Glenrothes and Mount Fife is right to raise the opportunities we have in the energy sector that are supported with this budget, to Edinburgh, North and Leith, the New Deal for working people, Glasgow East, that business confidence is growing, Western Isles, the NHS, unfortunately, only but name in his constituency due to the mismanagement. Glasgow North, the right to say the choices that we've had to make in this budget. Paisley and Renfrewshire South, the social care problems we're seeing in Renfrewshire. Adrian Shotts, he is a champion for manufacturing jobs, and my honourable friend from Dunfermline Dollar on the mine workers' pension. The Chancellor's budget provides the Scottish Government with the largest financial settlement in the history of devolution. An additional £1.5 billion for the Scottish Government to spend in this financial year, and an additional £3.4 billion to spend in next. So let's have no more buck passing, blaming Westminster and ducking of tough decisions. This budget provides the SNP Scottish Government with more than adequate resources to deliver real and meaningful change in our economy and our public services. So let there be no question about it. Any ongoing failures are those of the Scottish Government. They must own them and take their responsibility. They have nowhere to hide. The ball is in their court. And as my friend from Midlothian, the honourable friend from Midlothian said, I was proud to vote for that budget.
Thank you. The question is that this House has considered the fiscal impact of the autumn budget 2024 on Scotland. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order.